Meeting is now live.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Citizens Advisory Exec Team meeting on January 6th. It is 6 o'clock in the evening. I am Becky McCabe, board member, and
Jillian Barker, board member.
Before we begin, I have to read the following statement. Notice is hereby given that the school board is convening the Citizen Advisory Committee Executive Team meeting on January 6, 2021. On December 11th, 2020, Governor Pritzker issued a gubernatorial disaster proclamation for all counties in the state of Illinois, Executive Order 2020-74. In consideration of this, and due to the COVID-19 health pandemic, Board President Nicholas Mannheim has determined that a fully accessible in-person meeting on January 6, 2021 is not practical or prudent. As permitted by Public Act 101-640, this meeting is being held without the physical presence of a quorum at the District Administration Center location. Citizens and staff may view the meeting via a live stream of the meeting by visiting the link located on the District 303 website. The recording secretary is directed to include this determination in the minutes of this meeting. No votes will be taken at this committee meeting. Each board and committee member shall now announce his or her presence in the virtual meeting and confirm that he or she can hear other board members. So I'm going to say your name, and would you please say that you're here and that if you can hear. Board member Barker.
I am here and I can hear.
Pat Stacy.
I am here and I can hear.
Garrett Seaman.
I am here and I can hear.
Kelly Taylor.
I am here and I can hear.
Natalie Assell.
I am here and I can hear.
I believe that is it. Is that correct, Dr. Pearson? Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Tonight we're going to spend time reviewing where the facilities process has been going, and to talk about any issues or comments or thoughts that we should be considering as a board moving forward. So Dr. Pearson, could I turn it over to you to begin the conversation? And Mr. Critta, thank you for being here, and I expect you will help lead the overall view of the facilities update.
Sure. So as you probably know, back in December, the committees met a couple of times, and at least on one occasion did some site visits to some of our buildings. Actually, I think it was two times that you did site visits.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Two nights. Yeah.
And so, you know, I think that it will be really good to hear from both Mr. Critta and Mrs. Smith this evening to kind of talk about where those committees are in their work and kind of how much more we feel like needs to occur before we're ready to provide information. So I think it's a good, maybe Dan, if you want to talk about that.
Sure. Well, picking up from the tour times, we had a follow-up meeting after the tours to debrief, so all the focus groups individually could talk about what they saw more in terms of the lens that their group is focused on. So the physical conditions, the community spaces, and the learning spaces. And there's a little bit of overlap between things, but once you see buildings firsthand, it's hard not to comment on other things that stood out in their minds. So that also became kind of the stepping stone for our next part of our process, is defining what are our findings. And our findings were related to not just the tours, but the data that we'd presented the 2 or 3 meetings prior to that. So basically there was a lot of data uploading for the group to understand. Some of it was in the documents, some of the things were questions that they asked that we brought information back pertinent to their focus groups. And then the next step here going into January is we're looking at this week's meetings tomorrow night and then on Tuesday kind of the last round of focus group meetings where they'd be branched into their own individual groups. And then we'll come together as a full committee again on the 21st. And the goal of this next focus group meeting is to let each group kind of walk through the findings one more time and develop a list of priorities, or what are the needs statements relative to their areas of focus, and then bring that to the full committee to discuss as a full group on the 21st. And the goal at that time would be have basically a consensus on, and there'll be some overlap, but consensus from each group that these needs make a lot of sense. It's on par with the other committee members or their focus group peers. And that will be our springboard to go into the next phase where we're developing options or solutions. But the checkpoint that we talked about having it after the 21st is to bring an update to the Business Services Committee on the 25th. And then at the board meeting in February, we would give a little more formal review of here's the need statements that the committee has determined to date. Based on any input from the board at that point in time, and the administration obviously we would tailor the next step a little bit, but then the 2 months then from that point on would be focusing on solutions. How do we address those needs statements physically at each of the sites? Some of them are going to be more broad, and some of them will be a little more specific that will affect just specific buildings. And it'll be us over a series of meetings with the full committee then bringing back solutions and testing. Does this seem to meet the needs or solve the issues that we talked that are priorities? And then that group will fine tune those solutions to end up with one final plan or one recommendation. So that's a series of, I believe it's 4 meetings with the full committee, and then one prep meeting prior to the April board meeting that we would present that more formally, or the committee actually should present that as they are the spokesmen for the recommendation, spokespersons. So that's kind of a broad overview. I can share a couple diagrams too that we'll be sharing with the focus groups this week to remind them, here's where we are in the process, here's what it looks like going forward. If this group would like to see that, I'd be glad to share. But if there's any questions based on what I just outlined, glad to answer those as well. And Carol, maybe you have another perspective too of just some of the feedback from our committee members. I don't want to take the whole floor.
No, I was just so impressed by the thoughtfulness and how our committee members really went in with their eyes wide open and with no preconceived notions. It was really interesting to hear the feedback from people who said, well, I've never been in this building before, or, and it was also interesting to me that when we came back and debriefed in all of the groups, that there was so much, people were really thinking the same thing, no matter what group they were in. So that leads me to believe that they're noticing the same things, and that that we'll probably have really great cohesive kind of conversations about what the needs are.
I don't have any particular questions about what has happened. Are there any exec team folks who would like to weigh in on how the process has been going so far? No?
I'm gonna piggyback on Carol. I was involved in both nights' tours and in the meetings that followed those tours, and it was amazing to me. It was almost verbatim in some cases what people's concerns were, and there was, nobody knew what they said the night before, maybe except me or Carol. So that was really, really interesting, and I think, as Carol said, that will lead us to some connected conversation, because I think those problems sort of stand out, or those concerns sort of stand out. And so moving forward, hopefully we'll have a great plan.
Kelly?
I piggyback on both what both of you said, but I found it interesting how some of the things the schools wanted we were asking if their list was itemized in order or not, and we weren't sure. But we were like, really? They need this? They need that? But then when we got there and saw it, we're like, oh, yeah, they do. So I think some of those things that the schools thought they needed, once we got there, the majority of us felt the same way on a lot of the items. So that was good to actually see it, because to hear about it and picture it, it's not the same as actually seeing it. So I think it was a very well-planned and very well-executed exercise that we did. And it got everybody more on board with what we need to do for the future planning of this. And I think many of us would agree that it was time well spent. So it took a little bit of time, and I appreciate everybody that was involved to plan it, because I knew it took a little bit of time, but it was well worth it for me.
Great.
Is there anything that you would like us to bring back to the board on the 11th? We have a meeting on the 11th when we discuss this committee that you would like us to clarify, or is there anything that we can do to support the process or the work that you're doing?
Do you feel you have, you've been working hard, clearly, and you've been meeting a lot. Do you feel the timeline is realistic? Do you feel that, should we be prepared that maybe you need some extra time? Or are you feeling like the pace is good and people have the time to invest in the work?
I can start the answer. I don't know if it's directed at the whole team, but I would say also to Ms. Barker's question that as far as the board understanding, we're kind of at a crossroads here as we get to this last phase of creating need statements. It's really looking for as much consensus as we can get out of this committee to agree that these are the priorities and we should pursue how do we solve these, and then make that part of our recommendation to the school board. That's the committee's charge. And I think from a timing standpoint, Ms. McCabe, there's we've extended out about a month from our initial schedule way back before a lot of things kind of unfolded over the last year. We're about a month slower than that, looking at April as a more formal presentation. I would say the only thing that might put a little bit of a wrinkle in that is if our committee needs more time to get to a consensus. We're looking at between our focus group meetings and then the January 21st meeting. But as Pat and Carol both emphasized, there's a lot of overlap between the committees. I think their mindset is very focused on the same types of challenges. So I don't see that to be a problem, but if we, on the 21st, find that we need more time, that might be a point that we say, let's give this committee a little more time to reach that consensus point. Because as we look at testing solutions for those needs, if there's not focus on the consensus, the needs will be infinite. We'll be spinning our wheels, creating so many different solutions that we really want to have a pretty pinpointed list of needs that we're trying to solve. And there'll be options for sure as we develop that, but I think we want to get the options down. There's always going to be really one best strategy. That's what we've found, at least. So having as close as to consensus on those needs gives us a great springboard to do some solution development. So right now, I think we're okay. I think we've got about 5 meetings planned after the 21st to let that group come together and really talk about, okay, here's one way we could solve this at multiple buildings or across the district, and test those solutions against their thoughts. But I mean, obviously something could happen where we need a little more time, or we come to a point where there's some more debate needs to be, more thoughtful debate needs to occur. But I think right now it's mapping out pretty close to what we anticipated.
I also wanted to, oh, go ahead, Garrett.
I think back, Jillian, to your question on kind of getting a response back from the board. I think kind of understanding when the rubber hits the road in these need statements, that's where we're going to see kind of some actionable items. And I think that the process has been fruitful to build towards that. I'm still a little bit unclear about how the needs statements and the ultimately the solutions are going to kind of get prioritized and then be equitable across the entire system. One that kind of comes to mind that I know was a salient theme across the groups was kind of around ADA compliance or accessibility to buildings and what that looks like in some of our modern buildings versus some of our buildings that need to be updated. So we'll figure this out, but I'm just, at this point, I'm a little bit unclear on when we create a needs statement around that, how you push that out equitably across the entire system, or maybe it's not. And then where the board and then feedback from the board and where they're prioritizing maybe that particular need to another need around classroom size or something else that's maybe a salient theme. So feedback from the board on that piece will probably be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, I would echo, Garrett, your sentiments there that you started in terms of prioritization, especially for things like ADA compliance. You sort of read my mind, because there's a way to be compliant and then there's a way to be inclusive, in coming from ADA compliance when you look at buildings like Wild Rose and you look at buildings like Lincoln. So I do think some guidance from the board, if there are absolute non-negotiables that they'd like to see on that list, would be helpful for the committee or even from district administration in terms of like, these are absolute non-negotiables that as a district and as a community, we expect that all of our buildings are ADA compliant so that folks can access every point in the building. Like those types of statements are helpful in terms of helping guide. That really is the most salient one that I could think of too, Garrett. But if there are absolute non-negotiables, I think just let us know so that we can put those at the forefront of those needs statements, because other things are really nice to have things, but not necessary things. Yep, teachers should have teachers lounges. Absolutely. I agree with that. But in a prioritization, like what do we absolutely have to have as a district?
I was going to say the same thing, the dream versus the reality, and having that, maybe not asking the board yet, but just kind of, we're still doing the tasks and figuring out where we are trying to prioritize that as a whole. Because in my little group, I'm not like Pat, I didn't go to any other groups, so I see what my group has. So we were questioning, what are the other groups saying? And it'd be interesting to see what the other groups are saying. And if we're all coming into the same silos, that's going to be great. If not, then what do we do and how do we move on? And I'm sure there's pathways, but I also feel like we've been dreaming, but what's the reality of this? So we are working towards figuring out what the high priority pieces are and then moving forward from there. So if anything to report back to the board is we're still a work in progress, but we are coming back together to kind of see what the top ones are. But
so there's a point in February, that's not the formal, or no, the checkpoint update, I'm sorry, to the board is on the 25th, correct, of January?
Yeah, that's our target for the business services meeting. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe after that meeting, then the board can have that discussion. You'll have some of those pieces maybe in place to be able to kind of give us an idea of what, so that we can give you some of those maybe absolute non-negotiables. And kind of the dream versus the reality, and so can Dr. Pearson. We can have that discussion.
Tied to that, and maybe this is just a Becky thing. I would love, if you felt it wasn't going to intrude, to just listen to your debriefing. And I don't even know if I have time to do that, to hear the thinking, and Dr. Pearson will laugh, and the processing that you go through to where you are, so that the report, for me anyway, would have some depth to it, that I would be able to see how you have landed where you are. For me, that would be very educational, and it would help me to understand what you've struggled through to do the priorities, and what ways, instead of just a report or a document. I don't know how that has worked in your process, Dan or Dr. Pearson, if that is a possibility. I wouldn't want to make any comment or anything like that, because I think that this is your work, but it would help me in the thinking later. Any thoughts, Dr. Pearson?
Well, I mean, they are public meetings, so you certainly would be able to attend. I guess, I think ultimately the work of the committee is going to come to the board for a broader discussion. So back to the kind of dream versus reality piece, I think it's important that first we hear the dream. Like, what is it that, what is the whole list? Like, if we could do the whole list, what is the whole list? Because it is quite possible that over the next few years, we are going to be able to accomplish all of that. So it's better to kind of hear that first and then say, okay, look, this sounds great, but there's really no way for us to do this logistically or from a budgetary standpoint. So now let's go back and look at, from a priority standpoint, what are the must-haves? So like, is ADA important, which it is? So is that a priority? Yes. Is classroom size or space equity, is that important? Yes, maybe that's something we decide is important. Is it important that our elementary schools all have spaces for art and music and empower? Is that a priority? So we could then begin to prioritize some of those needs and requests. But it is also possible that when you come with the list, we can say, yep, this looks great. We can probably do this. So now let's put it in an order of kind of what's going to happen first, as opposed to maybe we need to eliminate some things from the list because it's just not quite possible. Right now, I think the only thing that's really off the table, and it's because we just don't feel like it's the right way to approach this, is a referendum. At least in our preliminary conversations with the board, they weren't really willing to do that to raise the money. So we want to try to work within the financial means that we have available. But other than that, I think many of the things that have been discussed are things that are possible. So it will be interesting to hear that and then maybe work out the priorities after that.
I like
Are we bringing the board new information? Or is the board able to, as Garrett and Natalie said, are they able to give us non-negotiables? I mean, has the board had any discussion about facilities such that they could, okay, Becky's shaking her head no.
No,
So
the only thing I would say is the charge statement that you were given. I think the board kind of said, here are some outcomes that we would like from this report. So if we go back to kind of those bulleted items, and I know that Dan has used that as a foundation for your discussions, I think that at that point was the hope of what they wanted to make sure it is at least a part of the discussion.
Okay.
We haven't talked about it since, and I like what you said, Dr. Pearson. I would be disappointed if I didn't hear the dreams. Because this is an opportunity for us to really think into the future. So I wouldn't want to give you. I do think we have said we're not going into this with the idea of a referendum, so that would be on the list. But we haven't really talked about, no, we can't talk about this, or no, we're not doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I would think those points that we talked about, if you recall back, or if you want to listen back to that discussion, where we did discuss those things that had to find solution one way or another. And some of those things were, now I'm trying to remember, the primary, intermediate, or elementary. That was one of them. Help me, Becky.
Yeah, I didn't pull it up.
Let's see. Oh, early childhood was on the list, and accessibility was on the list as well. So there were some points where we wanted you to come up with what you recommend, or the need statement for that, and then what do you recommend, or solutions you may recommend, as as kind of a broader sense of the community coming together to do this work. So I think those were they're broad categories, but within them, I know that you may come up with some things that we may not have thought of, and I would definitely want to hear those things as well. You've gone out and done visits, and you're having these discussions with other people and hearing things you may not have heard before. So I would definitely want to hear if you guys come up with a need that we didn't put on the list, please feel free to bring that to the table.
And I just pulled the charge up. We did spend a good time as a board putting that together, hoping to make it broad enough that you would touch on multiple things, more than just are they ADA compliant. So, but you've been looking at that charge, I think, right, Dan? You guys have used that as your guidance.
Yeah. We've actually, a lot of the focus group topics have been subsets of that charge. And some have gotten more traction and more conversation than others, to be honest. The group as a whole hasn't gone as deep on some topics because they seem like they didn't have, there wasn't a lot of data or conversation necessary. So we're covering them. It's just, the highlights, the priorities are starting to surface now of where the focus is, and that's why they're focus groups, because they are starting to, the groups are starting to spend some time really zooming in on, these are the things that stand out to us that really should be the challenges that get addressed.
I know Mrs. McCabe had mentioned possibly being able to listen to some of the discussion to understand the process, and I understand that we don't necessarily want to attend those meetings because we don't want that shift to happen in the discussion. Are there notes being taken that can be shared with between the different groups, so they could see what each other is thinking and that's coming to fruition within those groups?
Good question. We've been taking meeting minutes and issuing that before the next meeting, so people get a refresher and understand, here's how we've documented our conversations from the last meeting. We haven't, from focus group to focus group, we have not overlapped those. The hope is that we're boiling it down over the next couple meetings here. So when we get together as a full committee, we're hitting the needs and the findings that those groups were steady on. And it's not to say that those minutes can't be shared, and some might ask that we'd like to have a more background about the thought process in this, but a lot of the conversations we've had have been documented in meeting minutes.
Okay. I wonder if Ms. Taylor, I think you're the one that requested maybe knowing what the other groups are coming up with and what they're discussing. Is that something that you would find value to have?
Well, I know that we had talked about looking forward, Dan, remember, to seeing, Jen and I were saying, we were looking forward to seeing what the other groups were, to see if we're even in line with what they're doing, or if we have our own silos. And that was just I wonder what they're doing. Are we in line at all? Are we overlapping at all? Because I would assume, right, that we are. And the way he was smiling told us that, yeah, you guys are, but I don't want to go there yet. And I think it's part of the process that we don't go there yet. And I understand that, and that's okay by me. But I think when we come back together as a whole, right, Dan, that's when we're going to kind of see how it all kind of goes together. I don't mind not seeing the other notes yet, because we have enough of our own thinking and what our task is. But I personally, in my heart of hearts, when we come back together as a CAC, I don't mind that the board members are there because it is a CAC meeting, but that's Kelly Taylor speaking, not the rest of you. So if that's a question, that's my opinion. But again, I think that that's part of the process, right? That we kind of do our own thing in the tasks and then come back as a whole and see what everybody else is doing.
Exactly. And part of that was so people could gravitate to where their passions are or their agendas are, as far as whether it's community-based physical conditions or learning environments. We let people move to those different focus groups. So that's what we're trying to stay on topic with. But there's a lot of overlap, and especially when through the tours and the debrief on the tours, you could start to hear the overlap. But each focus group does have topics that they're creating need statements now that are underneath the umbrella of community spaces. So some of the need statements, although you'll see some overlap, my belief is that there will also be some that are specific to community spaces, whether it's athletics or performing or partnerships. They've tried to stay focused on those things. It's hard not to bridge out of it a little bit, but for the most part, each focus group is staying in their realm, so to speak. So it'll be great to share because you'll hear, I think, the overlaps will be kind of below the surface is what I'm suspecting. You'll see.
Did you feel that you got sufficient information about programs and within the buildings across the district, so that before you start to unpack everything, you have a pretty good sense of what our schools offer and how they are operating with those programs?
Yeah, I do. I think the learning and teaching involvement, as we brought them in too, to do an initial part to explain what's on the horizon and what they're thinking about from a program standpoint. I think that was a good platform for the learning spaces group to hear that right out of the chute. And along with some of the comments from building specific needs, those two things kind of dovetail together. So I think we have, but I also think that's an evolving topic, that what we're seeing in educational design is flexibility, so you can adapt to whatever is coming, because especially a year like we had this year, things are going to change a little bit, and flexibility and adaptability are probably at the forefront. We're less designing space for very specific reasons. So those programs just need to, you kind of understand, can they work in the environments that you have available? There's some exceptions with, a culinary arts program obviously is very specific, or automotive, but for the most part, taking a much more universal approach has been the way design's been going in schools.
I also wondered if we felt we had the right voices around the table. Do you feel that we had talked at one point if there was a need to bring it to a larger community forum? What's your thinking after where you are now? Is that something that you think is necessary or wanted?
Well, this is probably a great sounding board, this group here, to talk about that. It's really a preference of, do you think the community needs to hear something or a checkpoint in the process? We had tentatively said that sometimes around the need statement developments, where the committee has said, this is what we feel is important and we think we should address in our district going forward. That might be a good checkpoint to get a broader litmus test with the community. The forum that we have available for that obviously is a little different than ideal. It's not packing an auditorium. It's going to be on a broad Zoom call or something like that. So the forum at which that gets delivered, I guess, is a good question. How do you think that could be successful? But that would be normal. As I look back at this process, that would be a point at which we'd get a little more community. At least it's informational. If it's not a feedback session, at least it's, here's what this committee's hard work has developed as a need statements going forward before we get into solutions. So I'd be glad to, if the other people have thoughts on that.
Kelly?
I did want to add that we did have a couple of teachers on the tours, a couple of administrators, I don't know if they're administrators, but staff and students. We had one student on in the tours I was on. So I felt like there were more representation. So they aren't on, one of them, I think a couple of them are on the CAC as a whole, or at least they were. But I did see some more people on the tours, so that was good.
Right,
And
and
I
we
know
were
there's
very
more people.
intentional with that. I mean, the students that you saw are part of the CAC, but the other staff members, the teachers and the staff members are not. We were very intentional in putting them on there, not only for their perspective, but also to help the members because they live and work in those buildings and can provide a different perspective than those of us who aren't in that setting all the time.
Yeah, because personally, I was concerned about not having windows in some of the classrooms. And the teachers go to school and it's dark and they leave when it's dark. And that could be wearing over time. And you wonder why our teachers leave and stuff like that. And the teachers were like, well, you just kind of get used to it. And I was like, really? That doesn't bother you? Like, no, I kind of like my little hole in the wall. I'm like, okay. So it was a different perspective to hear that from a couple of teachers that as an outsider looking in, you're like, really? Oh, okay. But they didn't mind it. So it wasn't on their priority list. So it was neat to see some other perspectives, but also on the task force. I know you were intentional, Carol, in putting some people on there that aren't part of the CAC or now are, or however that worked out. But I think that's been another voice that was needed. And I think that was probably because of our last conversation saying that we needed some of that. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
I know, I think it would be very helpful to figure out some way to have a community forum of, and you're right, Dan, it would just be, won't be anywhere near as interactive as one would have if we could do in person. But I think you guys have done so much work and you're going into the really harder part of it. I think it would be good for the community to hear what you've done. Having been a citizen on a committee that did this work, I wish we had had more community visibility, because we turned over a report to the board who just said thank you and put it in the garbage. So I think it's really important that we recognize how much work is going into it, but also the pieces that have been involved in it. And then we also know that there are people who would probably want to share some of their thinking as well. I don't know. But I would be, as one board member, be really encouraging if we can fit it in and figure out a way to do it, to make that happen. Any exec team members have any thoughts? Pat?
At what point, Dan, are our need statements completed?
Well,
When you look at dates.
yeah. Date wise, well, so the 21st is our hope to come to as a full committee together and share, and there'll probably be some fine tuning at that point. But I think there's also a window for the board involvement over the business services and the board presentation in February for some, they may ask, can you give us a little more background on this, or can we reshape this? So there might be a little bit of modification, but I would say after the 8th, we'd have a good template to share beyond the people that have been kind of boots on the ground in this.
8th of February is board meeting?
Yeah.
So would it be possible, or if needed, if we did end up deciding it was needed, that same presentation that's given to the board, or maybe not to business services, because if we tweak things, that could be presented somehow to the community. How, I don't know the answer to that one either, but I mean, would it be any different, Becky, than what we're presenting to the board?
Well, that's a really good question. Dr. Pearson or Dan, what's your thinking? I guess I was thinking more of it a forum so that there could be input from the community, but I don't know how you can.
And my only concern about that is I'm not saying no to community input, but there's so much work that has happened before that got us, all the steps that got us to this. So when you present it and you have someone pop in and say, well, how about this? Well, okay, we got here because of this, and this. I don't know how to join those two.
My other piece, like Pat, just building off your idea, is, you know, the input, like what lens would we like the input from? Because the community can be very broad. Is it the lens of, you know, I am seeking this opportunity out and I'm going to come and make sure that, you know, the things that my children or my neighbors' kids are involved in are represented in this? Or could we approach community feedback from a way that might elicit and target, like from an equity standpoint that the district is working on, in terms of like a variety of groups and participants from identified groups getting feedback relative to that. So I think if the board is looking for community feedback, I might suggest what structure might be the best for that, in terms of getting feedback that this project has been designed to do, in terms of looking at equity, looking at accessibility of lots of different facilities, and not just from like an ABA or an ADA standpoint, but from instruction, like, and how could we focus that versus just an open forum?
Well, I think, and I'm just thinking about, Pat, what you were saying, Natalie, it may even be that we look at a larger community feedback when we have multiple solutions to a need. And that's where we would be looking for feedback, because you're identifying needs. We don't necessarily need feedback on are these the needs. We need feedback on maybe there's 3 solutions that you came up with to a need, and that's where we might need the larger community.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking maybe the community piece is later in the process, after the board has to make decisions. So I can see that may be a board piece rather than a CAC piece. Yeah, it makes more sense to me as I listen to you talk to wait until we gotten your report and the board wants to, okay, here's where we're at. I don't know. What do you think, Dr. Pearson? You think that? And we lost Mr. Seaman.
Yeah. So no, I agree with all of that. I agree with what Pat said. I think the danger that we have when we just, and it's the same reason we have CAC structured the way that it is because there's so much learning that takes place to inform the decision-making process, that you want to honor that as well. I do like the idea of once the need assessment is done and we start to develop solutions, maybe that is a point that we come back and say, here are the solutions that have been developed, provide us some feedback on that. I think that's a great way to think about it.
And I'm going, and maybe some of you remember the big, I forgot what we call them, the big strategic,
Summit.
Pardon me? The
summit?
summits. Yeah, and people actually got to kind of vote for certain concepts. So that, and maybe by that time we can be in person. Who knows? Okay, well, I would be satisfied with that. Kelly, you got your hand up?
I just want to remind everybody that the CAC was vetted by Carol and Becky and Jill and powers that be to encompass our community. And just to put that on record, that we tried really, really hard, not me, I was just part of, you know, the interview. But I think that they did a really good job in selecting a really great group of people that care about the community, all demographics, and really are trying to make this a better place for our kids and a better place for our community and a better place for learning and encompassing all of that. And I really feel in my heart that if we're going to open it up to every single person, there has to be a serious structure that takes place, because I thought that's what the CAC was, in that you had that community already represented. And that's what we're working hard and working to do. And there's how many members in the CAC right now?
About 22.
22. And then we added X amount, 12 or 15 more for the
Well,
task
for
forces.
this process, correct.
Yeah, for this process, we added more. So I feel that it's a very diverse, incredible group of people that are really putting forth a lot of effort. And I don't want to forget that fact, in that there are really a lot of our audience is part of our community, and we are. Now, I know that we want to have this open forum and thing and a QA session or whatever it is that we want to do, but I think we're kind of chasing our tail right now because we aren't there yet. And that's what you concluded, Becky. So I appreciate that. And I just wanted to remind everybody that we have a really great group of community members that are serving and working hard, and we all know that. So thanks.
Thank you for saying that. And I know Mrs. Barker and I think you're a great group for sure. So we appreciate that. So then what we can say to the board is that they'll get to have a beginning conversation at business services. And then at the February board meeting will be the full presentation. Is that the best way to say it?
Yeah, the need statements, the findings and needs. So you can see a little bit of thought process, but ultimately that will be the need statement that launches into developing some solutions.
And so, we, if you haven't noticed, our board doesn't sit on the sidelines. They don't like to ask lots of questions. So I think they will be a really good audience in asking questions and thinking through things. And so, and if you feel that the timeline is good, I'm very satisfied to report to the board that you all are working hard and moving forward. Are there any other thoughts? Mrs. Barker, do you have any other thoughts?
No, I think if anyone has anything else to discuss, then let's do that now before we adjourn.
I just wanted to make sure that we answered the question of, can you guys come to the meeting?
I mean, I think we can. We just.
I mean, not as you can, but I think personally that you should be coming to the CAC meetings as a whole, because isn't that part of your purview? I mean, I don't know how else to say it.
I think the question I have is, if we attend, does it become, Dr. Pearson said it's an open meeting. See, this is a very formal kind of process. Mm-hmm. And to be really frank about it, I prefer to just be in the audience for once rather than having to worry about all the formality. So, okay. But again, I want to sit in and just be able to hear what you talk through. So I don't know.
Well, I think Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of the digging and the deep stuff was done in the task meetings. It's not going to be anything new at the meeting of the whole, right? It's just more of a synopsis of bringing it all back together.
Yeah. So the next two focus group nights, which will cover the three groups, are tomorrow night and Tuesday. And then as we go to the 21st, that'll be the full facility planning committee getting back together. And you're right, Kelly, there's really not a lot more information that we need to share. It's going to be more debating and kind of reaching a agreement on what are the needs we're going to move forward with. There might be questions that say, boy, we'd like to know more about this. And we've had those all the way through, and we've done some research, and Carol's been great along with John of digging for that information if there's questions that have come up. So sharing that along the way. And there might be a little bit of that, but I think you're right that the data and the facts are kind of in everybody's laps now. It's talking about how to digest it and respond to it. Just a couple things is before you close. I think Dr. Pearson captured my thoughts exactly on the dreaming versus being real practical out of the chute. Only because you don't want the low hanging fruit to get in the way of something that's much more compelling and right for the district. And the tendency is if you draw the line or a baseline that starts everybody's thinking moving in a direction, that the dreaming will start to get limited. So I think that was exactly how you should think about it, is do the limitations when you have some options to say, we're not going to go this route, but we can at least get here. And it still solves most or all of our needs in another way. So I think that was right on. And then I also, from a community forum standpoint, where you've landed, I think makes a lot of sense. We usually see 2 community checkpoints. One would be when the need statements are development. If you want to test that out or just inform the community, this is the work of this group has developed these as broad need statements. And they're usually broad enough where there's some room to move in. Otherwise, there would be only one option. So they're broad enough statements that I don't think the community you typically don't find them missing something. There's always going to be some, more specific agendas that come out of that. And then the second checkpoint with the community is at the point where the board is seeing the options and looking at how do we move forward with this plan, is getting that feedback from a broader audience of how does this look? What do you think as a broad group? These are the things that we're now going to be making decisions on, and you want to have that broader litmus test. So those aren't sacred checkpoints. That's just what we've seen work pretty well to involve the community.
And if you're bringing it to the board, that the community will hear the needs statement. They won't. So, okay.
True. Yeah, absolutely.
So, so Kelly, what we'll do is we'll talk with administration to see how that would look, if it has to be, if it makes it easier that it is a formal committee meeting and we have to do formal things, and then Mrs. Barker and I just turn it over to the group, or if it's just one of your meetings, that's the part, but we don't have to, we can get better details on that. We don't have to talk about that now, but thank you for wanting us to be there. Anything else that people want to weigh in on before we close? Thank you so much for coming. Mrs. Barker, do you want to?
Sure. So the next meeting of the CAC has not been planned at this time. It's TBD. And at this time, I'd like to adjourn the executive team CAC meeting on January 6th at 6:54 p.m. That's a record, I think, right?
That's a record.
Okay, everybody.